All right, it's about 12, so let's go ahead and start. Good afternoon. Thanks everyone for being here today for this webinar presented by Behavioral Economics in Action at Raman in partnership with the Behaviorally Informed Organizations Partnership. Although we're meeting virtually, we wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. My name is Jing Qi, and I am a postdoc at Bayer and the moderator for today's webinar. We're delighted today to have Michael Hallsworth, PhD, the Managing Director, Americas of the Behavioral Insights team. Before I introduce Michael, I would like to go over the ground rules for this webinar. Following this introduction, our speaker will deliver a 30 to 35-minute presentation. During the presentation, please submit questions for our speaker by clicking the Q&A tab at the top or bottom of your Zoom screen and typing into the entry box. At the end of the talk, and with time permitting, we will have a question and answer session in which I will select questions from the Q&A tab to ask our speaker. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Michael. Michael Hallsworth, PhD, is a Managing Director Americas of the Behavioral Insights team, BIT. BIT was set up by the UK government in 2010 as the original nut unit. Michael has been a leading figure in developing the field of applying behavioral science to government. His work has been published in, among others, The Lancet, the Journal of Public Economics, and Nature Human Behavior. He is the co-author of the Mind Space and East reports and the book Behavioral Insights, MIT Press, 2020. Thank you, Michael, for being here today, and please take it away.
Thanks so much. It's wonderful to be speaking to you all today. I have a presentation which I'm going to share now. So what I'm going to be talking about is the way that behavioral science has been applied, has been popular, and really what we need to think about in the future. I'm assuming you can all see my presentation, but somebody please interrupt me if you can't. And the questions I posed are, how can we apply behavioral science better, and why do we need to? I'm actually going to focus on the why do we need to start with, before I get into the how. So I think one thing to say is that there's been a lot of interest, there's been a lot of attention, there's been a lot of resource dedicated to behavioral science over the last decade or so. That comes in terms of, say, units set up, dedicated institutional resources. It comes in terms of contributions, in terms of books, networks like BIOG, the Rotman School operates. It comes through media attention, and it comes through, we hope, also evidence that the approach has made a difference. And there are many examples, some of which I feature on this slide. Yet at the same time, there have been over this period various criticisms or critiques of the approach. Some of them saying what could be done better, coming from a place of wanting to improve things, and some of them coming from more a perspective of just like of skepticism in general. Now, what I'm going to do is briefly go through some of these critiques. I think they should be acknowledged and thought about. I'm not saying that they are all correct. So, if I was to sum up some of the criticisms, I would put them, as I have done here, as a sort of set of 10 different criticisms. I'm not going to go through them in depth, because I'll come to them as I go through examples, but they might be things like, behavioral science hasn't had a really big impact on major policy decisions. It's been sort of tinkering around the edges of smaller kind of downstream design questions, rather than being at the core of change, systemic change, and big policy decisions. That it may, for example, have a flawed evidence base. What's the implications of the replication crisis that many disciplines have been through? Can we rely on the findings? In what contexts? Is it overconfident in some of the knowledge it has? And the way that we apply that knowledge, and the way we kind of interpret and diagnose behavior and bring certain concepts to bear on it. Is there a lack of precision? Have we just been thinking about general prescriptions rather than being specific about how particular groups respond particular ways? And are our prescriptions just actually quite vague? And are we, for example, being too focused on individuals and too much thinking about individual findings from economics and psychology, and neglecting the broader social context in which human beings are embedded as social actors? I could go on for longer. My point is to raise these kind of objections and say that rather than ignoring them, I think we need to be thinking about them and thinking about how we can extend and improve the way we apply behavioral science over the coming decade. And I have some ideas of how to do that. But first of all, I just want to also say that in the last year or so, there have been two quite high-profile criticisms of applied behavioral science, which I actually think kind of missed the mark. Although I think there are legitimate criticisms to be made, I think these two have attracted a lot of attention. But actually, when you look at them, I'm not too convinced by them, or I think they have some flaws. So I'm going to go through these two in more detail for a second. The first one is a paper that came out earlier this year. It's just actually been published officially, called the IFrame and the SFrame: How Focusing on Individual Level Solutions Has Led Behavioral Public Policy Astray. Now, I feel I have to respond to this paper because among some people, it's attracted a kind of rapturous reception that I found a bit puzzling, unless it's just sort of telling you what you want to hear already. So the two authors of this are massively accomplished. I really respect them both. I know them both. They've done tremendous work over the past decades. So I feel I should say that as well. But that doesn't take away from the fact that this critique is pretty flawed. And I think we need to say why it is. Let's support the good critiques rather than ones that are kind of put together in a rather sort of strange way. So what does this critique say? It says that, first of all, behavioral scientists have focused on and tested policy ideas to fix problems with individual behavior, what the authors call the I-frame, rather than systems in which people behave, the S-frame. So I is for individual, S is for system. They say that this focus has been disappointing and, crucially, can reduce support for systemic changes. So there's a kind of trade-off between focusing the I-frame and the S-frame. And moreover, corporations like to promote I-frame solutions to avoid things like regulation and taxation that would harm their interests. And so there's kind of a useful thing for them to focus on I-frame, whereas actually the real sort of progress would be made focusing on the systemic frame. And therefore, they say that behavioral scientists may have unwittingly promoted the interests of the opponents of systemic change. And the best role for behavioral scientists is to use their skills to develop and implement system-level change. Okay, so let's just think about this for a second. Here are some problems to do with this critique. So first of all, it is quite naive about how policy is made in practice. When I read it, I think that it seems to be focused on various academic articles and how papers are presented at academic conferences, quite focused on the US and UK, and not actually how some of the discourses have gone inside the policymaking process and the way that behavioral science units or teams actually conduct themselves, which is much more balanced than the paper would suggest. And give you some examples of this in a second. But I think it would really benefit from having a practitioner involved in the writing of it, or a public administration academic who understands some of the actual nuances of how ideas are translated into practice. the evidence that's presented in this paper is often highly selective. So let me give you an example. Early on, they present this quote from the British Prime Minister David Cameron, talking about how his quote, the best way to get someone to cut their electricity bill is to show them their own spending compared to their neighbours. And so they say that this quote says that behavioral economics is an alternative to regulation. Now, David Cameron did say this. He was also campaigning for office at the time. And also, the behavioral science agenda has been going for 8 years since David Cameron was last Prime Minister. So it seems a bit strange to focus there. I would prefer to focus on what actually happened while in government rather than while campaigning for government. And we don't have to look very far to find some alternative quotes that could have been used. So this MySpace report, I happened to co-author it, was published by the Cabinet Office a year after this quote. And it goes to some length to say that MySpace powerfully complements and improves conventional policy tools rather than acting as a replacement for them. So there's a story about the political side of applied behavioral science, and there's a story about the more technocratic use of applied behavioral science. Only focusing on what is said publicly when campaigning for office neglects the more considered and broader understanding of behavioral science from the more technocratic strand of it. And I think this is not acknowledged anywhere, but it's extremely important because it's closer to the real application of behavioral science to policy, in my view. Third point is the way this paper is presented actually undermines its stated goals. So stated goals are behavioral sciences should be more involved in contributing to systemic change. The problem is that when this paper came out, it attracted a lot of attention that was more like this. Headline, "What Nudge Theory Got Wrong?" Now that's interesting because you could argue that the criticism is aimed at specifically nudging in this paper. But if you look at the subheading, "Is behavioral public policy a distraction from finding systemic solutions?" Well, that's much broader. Now, behavioral public policy is different from nudges. And the overall effect is not to say, oh, behavioral scientists should be involved more in developing systemic solutions. It's rather just to sort of cast aspersions on the wider field. So I would say that the goal may be in this paper to get more involvement in behavioral science in systemic solutions, but the effect is perhaps the opposite. Moreover, behavioral scientists may have been involved in systemic solutions more than the authors realize, and perhaps more than is apparent. So just yesterday, I noticed that my organization in the UK published this report, which is about understanding homicide, a framework analysis, which explicitly thinks about systemic factors and how behaviors are embedded in networks and how various factors may contribute to violent behavior. That is a world away from the picture painted in this report, and there are many other examples. I think, though, part of the problem is that as behavioral scientists, we talk about running trials, running experiments, what we did at point A and how that changed to point B. And those are really easy to talk about, really clear, so we kind of focus on them. And it's harder sometimes to talk about these messier, more systemic contributions to policymaking that we make. And so people tend to get an impression that running individual standalone trials is all the behavioral scientists do. It isn't. The claim of a specific causal link between the promotion of behavioral science and nudging and reduction in support for systemic interventions, to be honest, is highly dubious. So a few points. The evidence on this that actually happens is not clear, despite the claims in the paper. Personally, having done this for a long time, I didn't actually ever see this happening. And I know others feel this way as well. And in fact, what appears to be happening, in my experience, is behavioral scientists are coming in showing how behavioral science may actually show the importance for systemic solution. So here's the meta-analysis, which shows that the kind of spillovers they're talking about really are unclear and weak, and if anything, may go in the other direction. And just an example around obesity, they talk about some length. Well, the behavioral analysis of food consumption doesn't point towards individual level solutions. It points towards the automatic and non-conscious aspects of food consumption, which actually points towards reformulation which is a systemic solution, by the way, as the best way forward rather than individual level interventions. So there are just many examples that go against what they put in this paper, are not featured in this paper. And finally, the IFrame and the SFrame distinction they introduce is actually really quite unhelpful and not really not actually supported in the way things work in practice. So I think in particular, this neglects the contributions of complex adaptive systems and the way that we confuse behavioral science with understanding of complexity. And the reason I mention this is because complex adaptive systems show there isn't really a separation between the individual level and the system level. Instead, what happens is that higher level overriding features of a system can emerge from the lower level interactions in a way that is often fast and unpredictable and non-linear. You can see this in the way that the growth of variants of COVID-19 emerged in particular contexts and then went on to shape the overall nature of the pandemic. They went quickly from the individual level to systemic level. And so the two are innately connected in ways that are totally kind of disregarded by this paper. These things kind of norms, rules, and mental patterns and culture itself can emerge from aggregated social interactions, which then shape the overall structure in turn. And so this separation between IFrame and SFrame just doesn't hold in real world policy contexts. And in fact, I think there is a way forward to actually use new opportunities for behavioral science if we embrace that idea, this idea of cross-scale behaviors. Okay, so that's the IFrame and SFrame critique. The other critique is around the idea that there is no evidence for nudging. And so the story here is that in January 2020, there was a meta-analysis of the effectiveness of nudging, which concluded that overall nudge interventions had a fairly large effect on behavior, about the same size as I think online stress reduction interventions, for example. Now, I didn't say this at the time, but I thought that seemed a little high. Indeed, the authors did say that maybe there's some evidence of publication bias here. Fast forward to July 2020, there's a response to this article which says, oh, actually, the publication bias is so strong that there's no evidence for nudging after adjusting for it. And this, again, attracted a lot of attention. And again, I think the debate here gets it slightly wrong. And let me explain why. So in doing so, I'm going to draw on this article I put on Behavioral Scientists earlier this year, which tries to make sense of what's going on here. So first of all, what is basically happening is we have a separate source of evidence that suggests that there are effects from behavioral science interventions as a whole, even without publication bias. So I point towards this article in Econometrica from earlier this year, which basically took data from the whole range of studies that my organization did and the Office of Evaluation Sciences in the US did, and looked at their overall effect. Now, this is not around what's been published in the literature, it's actually what was done in practice, the full range of trials, which we gave access to these academic authors to do so. And they concluded that on average, there's around an 8% improvement over controls from the interventions. And this is putting publication bias to one side. But my point in raising this is not to say that we should then put that on the side of nudges work against nudges don't work, but rather the debate itself doesn't make much sense. There is a wide range of things we attach to the nudge label or that people have done. And some of these things are really different in really different contexts. And yet we talk about them in a really simplistic and binary way. Something is a nudge or isn't a nudge, and it does work or it doesn't work. But these analyses are putting together a whole range of things and attaching a single effect size to it. This doesn't make much sense. Instead, what we know, indeed, this is what is concluded by other people. For example, a couple of weeks ago, this data collider blog, very well respected, said, yes, this idea of meta-analysis for nudging doesn't make much sense. Instead, what we need to be thinking about, rather than these really binary oppositions, is to recognize the level of heterogeneity in effects, things that really vary from context to context and from different choices people make in intervention design. And other people have been saying this, so we need to get serious about that heterogeneity to understand it, rather than having this kind of really binary debate. That will allow us to apply behavioral science in a much more sophisticated and realistic way, rather than making really grand claims on either side. So I'm firmly of the view that that current debate around there is really strong evidence or there is no evidence is the wrong debate, and yet it's been was taken up quite strongly earlier in the year. So what should we do in response to some of these critiques, even if they're maybe coming at things in a slightly imperfect way? I think we need a new sort of set of principles to address some of these challenges and guide our practices. And I've used the language of a manifesto here, which is coming out really quite soon. I hope that puts together a set of proposals for how we could do things differently. And I'm going to build on some of what I just said and address some of those critiques. The manifesto has 10 proposals, which you can see here. They go through a whole range of things and different kinds of proposals. Some are about the technical aspects of how we do things, the way we can build in more adaptation to randomized control trials. Some more about the mentality of how we apply behavioral science. This idea that there is no view from nowhere, the no objective point from which we observe behavior like we're set aside from society somehow. We're not. Behavioral scientists are embedded in societies, in networks, and we bring ways of thinking and assumptions to bear. We need to be aware of those. We need to understand that there are real issues with the use of machine learning to target interventions in a way perhaps we don't think about. Can we use data science to increase equity and reduce inequalities and make sure it's not used for exploitation? I give you a very high-level examples of a high-level summary of various things. I can't go through all of them. I'm going to just highlight a few. And the first one I want to highlight is the first one on this slide, because it relates to this idea of wider impact for behavioral science. So I think taking together these different proposals can lead to behavioral science having an impact on bigger issues in the way that the IFrame and SFrame paper is critiquing. I agree more can be done, but I think a starting point is actually to change the way we think about and describe behavioral science and move it from thinking about behavioral science as a tool and more as behavioral science as a lens through which we see action. And here's why I think this. So I think that the strengths that have brought success for applied behavioral science may also be holding it back. So when the current way of applied behavioral science came along, there was a lot of pressure to demonstrate clear results, to build credibility, to show that the ideas that we were talking about had an impact in the real world rather than just laboratories, for example. And this led to similar process for developing and testing interventions. And there are various labels for this, but they basically involve finding a target behavior, developing a solution after exploring the situation and implementing a solution. But this tends to push you towards specific downstream interventions, if you like, with individual features. So you can say that we, with this specific intervention, changed this specific behavior through a randomized trial quite often. Now, that is a really strong approach, but what has tended to happen, I think, is this has made people think, when we talk about the experiments, as I mentioned, that this is the only way that behavioral science can be applied. And so that kind of shapes the kind of issues that are brought then to behavioral scientists, to nudge units, if you like. Behavioral science also has much to say about broader, larger issues in society. There are many examples. We have promoted this idea from the beginning, but the facts I just mentioned about how we talk about what we do have been pretty strong. So it feels like behavioral science has carved out a space which is around doing these kinds of interventions and has got credibility for doing that. But it feels like there's a window in which we can also show the wider things that we can do to shape perceptions about what is possible. And I think that this implicit metaphor is a specialist tool that we use in some situations and not in others for some behavioral problems, and as opposed to standard policy tools, it's actually really unhelpful and is causing part of the problem. If we see behavioral science as a lens, we see that we can't separate out this kind of behavioral and non-behavioral issues. Most public policy is focused on, or is at root to do with behaviors. Even regulation, taxation are intended to influence behavior, and therefore behavioral science has something to say about that and should be integrated into the core activities of an organization, rather than just sort of being an optional extra we can do sometimes and not other times. No, this is kind of crucial evidence for your core business. Behavioral science complements traditional approaches. It allows you to enhance taxation. It allows us to see the behavioral dimension of an approach or issue, to say, well, actually, our existing approaches may be flawed. They may be having counterproductive effects, rather than just kind of launching a new intervention. As I mentioned, I just made that point. And so this also points towards the need to focus more on diagnosis of what's going on, rather than pushing too soon to define a precise target outcome and intervention that addresses that outcome. And why am I talking about metaphor as a lens? It may seem very abstract, but actually we know that behavioral science knows that metaphors matter. When we make the case of what we do, we know from the behavioral science that show the metaphors we use, the framing of it is really important, and is a question as much of getting people to understand what you do, a political task of gaining support as much as an intellectual one. Other people have talked about the idea of moving from choice architecture to choice infrastructure. I think that's a great idea as well. My only caveat with that is infrastructures has the connotations of being something very often very fixed and concrete, whereas quite often we're thinking about shifting networks and so on. But I think, again, these metaphors are important. We have a lot more to do with existing approaches. We now need to expand beyond the area we've kind of got credibility in, allowing behavioral science to have wide potential before this kind of self-reinforcing cycle becomes too hard to break. And so that metaphor of a lens rather than a tool, I think, is the first step. And there are others that we can take. You saw the 10 proposals, and I'm going to talk really quickly about this idea of replication, variation, adaptation, building on the point around heterogeneity I made earlier. So the point here is that contexts influence results. And we need to pay attention to how this happens. So if, for example, you're running a trial, there are many different choices that are being made about the precise wording of messages, when they're given, how participants are recruited, and so on. And these choices can vary greatly between studies in ways that often go unnoticed. And that's true even for these large replication studies that have taken place that try to control for everything. So to do this, I just want to talk really briefly about this great study, which doesn't get talked about too much, called crowdsourcing hypotheses tests. And what they basically did was they put together 15 research teams. Each team was asked to create an intervention to test the same 5 hypotheses, which are all unpublished at the time. And these concern things like moral judgment, how people do negotiations, and so on. They then had 15,000 participants in 2 separate samples. They got randomly assigned to receive one of the interventions for each hypothesis. So teams come up with their own way of addressing a question. People are randomly assigned to get these different interventions. And then what they did was they looked at the results. And the effect sizes for each question do vary dramatically. If for 4 of the 5 research questions, different teams' interventions actually produced effects in opposing directions. So just think about that for a second. And the authors say that the results were radically dispersed, and that means that idiosyncratic choices in stimulus design have a very large effect on observed results. So these choices around how you set up an experiment really matter, and they vary from place to place. Have we paid enough attention to that? Second point around heterogeneity is the way that effects vary greatly between groups in a population. And again, this is machine learning, coming in to show us this. There's an interesting example, study in India showing how different kinds of feedback on your driving affects driving behavior very differently, whether it's a personal best message, an average driver message, so how does the average driver do, or another one. And basically, if you're a high performer, you really respond to your personal best message. And so these kind of variations matter and need to be taken seriously. Whereas a lot of the talk, and you saw this in the meta-analysis nudging discussion, is around overall treatment effects on large populations. How do we get marginal increase in behavior change in a big group? And I think that matters, that's important, but in the future, I think we need to be thinking more about this variation between groups as well, and understanding how we respond to it. So how do we respond to it? You know, if we have all this heterogeneity, what does it do to the way we talk about behavioral science? Well, I think one thing is we need to set a higher bar for claiming that an effect holds true across many unspecified settings. So I mentioned the Mindspace report, just going back to that, we have a statement in that saying, you know, we're strongly influenced by what others do. This is a very general statement, which may be true in some instances, but there's a ton of work done by, for example, the Center for Behavioral Norms and Dynamics in UPenn that's showing what goes on underneath that statement about when social norms do have an impact and when they don't. So there's a growing sense that rather than we need to be talking about hypotheses that were true in one place, and which may need adapting to be true elsewhere, rather than something that definitely works. And I think there is a precedent for talking about some of this stuff, because if you think about how maybe many behavioral scientists have talked about incentives, certainly in the past, they basically said like incentives generally work, but it depends on factors like the type, the magnitude, and timing, and who they are aimed at to have an impact. And I think those kind of caveats are really important for talking about behavioral science principles as well. And then in addition, what we need to be thinking about is building on some of the big studies that have started. So Behavior Change for Good is an initiative that talks about doing mega studies with many different participants testing similar questions. And I think that's great. We need to expand that to get a wider range of contexts and participants. But I think we also need to, unfortunately, explore this kind of heterogeneity systematically. And we have some studies a bit that do this, rather, you know, to tease out how, you know, to understand how this heterogeneity is having an impact. And I do think the crowdsourcing method I just talked about earlier has an impact. And I'm going to show you why, because from that same study, I mentioned those 5 hypotheses. Well, what they find is that for 3 of them, there's a high degree of variance, and they really can't be sure about them. But for 2 of them, there is pretty strong evidence that they do have that these are actually true, that these hypotheses may have been proved, but not just proved in one study, proved across 15 research teams who all had a different go at addressing this question, and then when people were randomly assigned to those interventions. So I think we can be sure about that result because it's taken into account a greater degree of heterogeneity. But this really is going to be a tough task. You know, collecting this kind of varied data is going to be hard, and I think there's going to need to be investment on it. But I think it is a way forward if we're going to get serious about what effects we have in different situations, rather than just saying, as Dilip Soman puts it, you know, going into a nudge store and taking intervention off the shelf and just implementing it and assuming it will work in the way we anticipate. These kind of things are more of the way forward. I was also going to talk about some other aspects around how we think about nudge plus self nudges and boosts, but I think we can save that for the Q&A because I'm conscious I'm at time and I want to leave time for questions. So yeah, this will be published very shortly, 10 proposals. There's more we can do, but let's separate out the critiques that have value from the ones that are perhaps less effective. and there's plenty we can do in the future. So thank you very much for your time. I'm really happy to sort of talk more and take questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Michael, for this wonderful presentation. And as we're waiting for other audience to type in their questions, we already have 2 questions here. So I would like to first ask you, we get a question from Dilip. In medical practice, we have workers with a variety of expertise, such as a doctor versus a paramedic versus nurse. Many health problems can be effectively dealt with by a paramedic. So likewise, not all organizational problems need a well-trained behavioral scientist. As we think about talent development, do we need to start thinking about such kind of distinctions in behavioral science as well?
So I think there's the starting response is, do we know what a behavioral scientist is quite often? So you say not, thank you, Dil, by the way, thank you for the question and invitation. So not all organizational problems need a behavioral scientist. Now, I think I know what a behavioral scientist is, but the term tends to be used quite widely, and there are relatively low barriers to entry to calling yourself a behavioral scientist, which is, an issue potentially. So I think one answer is that one of the goals for the behavioral science movement, if you want to call that, and one of the goals at a bit originally, was even just to kind of raise the base level of awareness of some of the evidence that was out there around human behavior. Now, there are risks to that idea as well, because it can mean that you have a very, say I'm a policymaker, I have a really high level or general view that social norms matter, and that can mean that sometimes there are less good interventions as well. But overall, having some awareness that some factors matter, and then potentially knowing where to go for more advice on that, I think is a good thing. And I think that has improved over the years. There is a greater awareness of some of the factors that maybe, people aren't pure utility maximizers, and there are some things we need to bear in mind. That base level awareness has increased, and I think that is a good thing. So you don't always need to be an expert to make some better choices there in the way you think about behavioral science. I think that is true. So I think yes to your question in the sense that you can get some improvements. If you're really committing a lot of resources, then it may be better to get a check from someone who's maybe more up to date on the current literature. It's my answer to that question, Dilip, which is a great one. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Well, so I actually have a question related to the one that Dilip just asked. So I know that when a unit started to establish itself, sometimes it have a centralized operating model, other times it might choose a diffused operating model. So I am just wondering, based on what you mentioned, do you feel like if you are going to establish a center of excellence, then it's easier to have a group of well-trained behavioral scientists? Those, for example, those actually have a PhD, whereas if it's a more diffused model or post-hoc model, then it's easier if we just pull people who have expertise in it, and they may acquire it just doing the job.
So there is a whole section in the manifesto about build science, behavioral science into organizations. And the main thing it tries to say is that perhaps a debate discussion around, do you have a diffused model of behavioral science in an organization or a diffused or a centralized model is important, but maybe not the most important question. And instead, what you need to be looking at is, how do you integrate behavioral science into the way the organization functions, rather than having like a dedicated resource? So the implicit ways that, for example, budgets are constructed, is there a lot of inertia involved in the process of constructing a core budget, rather than saying what we need to do is ensure that that budget goes to behavioral science functions in your organization. So I haven't got time to go through it all, but I think that kind of discussion about what level of expertise and where it sits in your organization, there's actually another dimension, which is like, what is like the choice infrastructure of your organization? How well are you setting the organization up to have behavioral science principles embedded into the way it works? And for me, that is the real goal and the real prize, because it involves scale and sustainability. Sustainability for a world potentially when people aren't asking for explicit behavioral science solutions. So it's not quite an answer to your question, but I think it's a relevant thing to bring up.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for your answer. So we have another related question here. Can you please share more about how we can operationalize using behavioral science as a lens in government? More specifically, what activities and deliverables might this include?
It's a really good question. And so this one, this particular recommendation is one I've talked about because of its sort of symbolic and importance. But actually, I don't have so many concrete recommendations for that one. It's more a mentality change in terms of how we talk about and present behavioral science when we talk about it. So it's like a self-reflective one. The concrete recommendations, of which there are many, come for the other proposals, really. And so, yeah, I answer is sort of no, I can't give you any concrete ones because it's more about a kind of, mentality and overall shift in the way we present behavioral science. But I have worked really hard in the other proposals to make things really concrete, because I know that's the hard thing. It's easy for me to say, oh, we should do this, this, and this, but it's hard to come up with concrete things. So I do have them, but not for that particular one, I'm afraid.
Yeah, so in your presentation, you mentioned 10 different kind of proposals underneath this new manifesto. Then the question here is, how did you select this list of proposals and what did you decide to exclude?
Yeah, great question. So one thing I wanted to do was not say the really obvious stuff, because I think if you'd asked me, about 4 years ago, I co-wrote an article on where's behavioral science going, and some of the things that came to mind there were fairly obvious. Like there were things like, oh, can we deal with bigger policy challenges? Can we understand how to influence organizations rather than individuals? Can we understand how the duration of effects, how long these last, which is a question that's been coming up for the last 10 years. And I think we have better answers now. But I wanted to avoid sort of making the obvious recommendations that other people had been making and that I'd seen elsewhere. And instead try to push that and say, what is the less obvious thing to say here, but which is really important. And that's why I haven't just said, oh, we should just use more data science, machine learning approaches for targeted interventions, but rather said, here are the issues with doing so. So that was one thing, make it non-obvious. Another thing I was quite keen on was to not make it purely technical and just say, here are some technical upgrades for the field, but rather to provide some reflections on also like the human side of it, the soul of it, in terms of how do we conduct ourselves, what things do we think about and not think about, how do we see ourselves as behavioral scientists, what is the diversity of the field of behavioral science, how can that be improved? So I didn't want it just to be technical, but more fundamental about the most philosophical is the wrong word, but deeper questions as well, rather than just saying everything is basically fine, here are some new tools. And then, it was so basically, the third one might be just things that I hadn't seen elsewhere, which I thought were important. So that's the non-obvious point.
Yeah, I like that way of thinking, not too obvious and not too technical. So far we've been talking about some big ideas on how to apply behavioral science. Now we have two questions on the terminology we usually use when we're talking about behavioral science. So the first one is, should we abandon the term nudge, given that it's such a broad category and applied to all kinds of different interventions? Perhaps the term now is more harmful to the field.
I think, like, I know where you're coming from. I think it's a bit drastic because it is a concept that makes sense to use properly. And I think that is part of the it is part of the overall policy mix, or the range of things that behavioral science does. It seems, I don't know whether the question is to abandon the term or to abandon the practice of nudges, because I don't think we should abandon the practice of them, because it may be that the analysis is that actually a nudge is the right solution or the right response to a particular issue. That's not always the case, but it might be. I also want to say that I think the term has been really great for sort of communicating or gaining attention for the field. It's been a way in to talk about the broader issues. So I think dispensing with it is a bit drastic. But I do feel that what is really important is to say that nudge is not applied behavioral science. It never claimed to be the same thing. And there has been a broader attempt to think about behavioral science and bigger issues that has been going on for a decade, even if it gets less attention than the term nudge, for better or worse.
Yeah, I think the intention here is not to really abandon the practice rather than just rethinking the term, because practitioners tend to just group everything together under the broad umbrella term nudge, and they will consider defaults as a type of nudge and sending out reminders also as a type of nudge. Yeah, so a related question. Hi, could you please talk a little bit more on choice infrastructure? Apart from investing in behavioral scientists, what all does it entail and how should leaders think about it? Thank you.
Yes. So first of all, I would say it is useful to go and read the article that I did not write on choice infrastructure, which I think is really great. So I'm going to send you the link in the chat now for you to look at it. So one thing, and I think that's just like a good answer to that. So in terms of what are we talking about here? So I would need to check what I put here, but I think many of the recommendations are actually same ones that are in the behaviorally informed organization book that Bayer and Rotman produced, which is, one of them is lowering the costs of experimentation in an organization. So being able to run experiments really, really easily. That's part of the choice kind of infrastructure that can support the use of behavioral science in organizations. Another one is potentially around just like the processes that you use. So there's a lot of interest in behavioral HR as a concept, and like so many human factors issues and this tends to get neglected as an idea. So I can't remember off the top of my head, but there's been lots of work done around performance reviews, for example, and the way that people make assessments. This is part of the sort of the wiring of an organization. And it's not just like we should be saying, can we hire some behavioral scientists, but then not think about how we performance review them, or how in general the organization performance reviews them. We should be thinking that as an important side of things as well. So it's like the institutional processes and setup that influence behavior. So, some of this is around organizational design, right? It may seem to you I'm just sort of gradually getting towards a field that has existed before, but I think there are real things you can do around that side kind of choice infrastructure in organizations. I haven't got the document open in front of me, so I can't remember some of the recommendations I made, if I'm honest with you. So I'll do that in a second, and maybe answer it in the chat.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I do remember in our conversations with some other units, they brought up the fact that infrastructure is one of the key success factors. And so, well, in the last about 10 minutes, I think we're going to focus a bit more on the future of behavioral science and their application in organizations. The first question is, are the frameworks we developed in our early years, such as East, Mindspace, now limiting our thinking? Does the field need to consider broader guidance when thinking about change interventions?
Yeah, I think probably that's true. It's so I think it should be seen rather than as a sort of ceiling, but rather a basis of a foundation for getting some of these ideas on the agenda, communicating them, then saying that there's more than this, more than set out in this particular sort of framework, more than the headline. So they've always had the purpose of trying to get that basis established, sort of some common points of discussion and thinking that we can then build on. If that's the level you remain at, then I think it is a limit. Yes, and I think that if we just knew about sort of the high level principles that are in these frameworks 8 years on, then it would be an issue, but we do know more. So I think they're very useful, but I think what we should know now is the ability to go on from talking about them to say, and here are okay, so you're interested in social norms, like this could be an area that is relevant to this policy challenge. Here are some other things we need to know about social norms, and here's how they sit in terms of other possibilities and other options. And you need to be careful about this. We know that from a study that came out last year. So it's a starting point rather than like destination, those frameworks. So that's generally how I think about them.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so the next question, it seems like the heterogeneity in the efficacy of behavioral science in different contexts could be related to the heterogeneity of our approach to the behavioral design processes. For example, different methods, different frameworks, and approaches design team are using. And you previously wrote about how the future of behavioral science demands human-centered design. Could you elaborate more on the role of improving the design processes using design thinking?
Yeah, so in the manifesto, we talk about this under the idea of exploring and enabling behaviors. So I'm just thinking about the first part of your question here, heterogeneity in the approach to the design process. I think the role of improving the design, I'm not quite sure whether you mean improving the role of the design process using design, that the design process itself should be improved through design thinking, or improving the way we use design thinking. Because yeah, I think it's right that the criticism would be that there has been design thinking in behavioral science, but it's been more like the kind of a top-down approach, like say Johnny Ive in Apple designing the iMac and then saying this is what people want. That's a great generalization, of course, but instead I think the kind of design we need to understand is how people are actually navigating their environments and the strategies they come up with. And I think we had less ability and resource to do that in the past, and we have more now. And I think this goes to the overconfidence point, because if you do that kind of exploration well, you may find out that the concepts that we thought were relevant around, I don't know, loss aversion or status quo bias or present bias, they actually aren't such good explanations of what's going on here. And so an example is why people may not be switching between energy providers. We had this example that it seems irrational, and I don't use the term irrational when I talk about behavioral science, because I think regardless of whether the concept of irrationality exists, it does. I don't think the consequences of using it are good, because I think it encourages this kind of overconfidence. But anyway, returning to the example, it may be rational not to switch energy suppliers in some instances, even though you could apparently save money. And actually what we found out through this kind of exploration and design thinking approaches is that for some people, the reason they don't switch is because they understand the collection processes of the energy supplier, and they know how long they have before enforcement action will take place. Like, is it 2 letters? Is it 3 calls, and so on? And they can use that time to pay other bills that are more pressing. And so there is a hidden advantage to staying with the provider, because you may not know what the collection process is for a different provider. And if you just go in there quickly with it, you might say, oh, this is status quo bias. It's just, loss aversion. People should be encouraged to move. And you don't understand the deeper reason of why people are behaving in a particular way, and the reasonableness, not the irrationality, but the reasonableness of their action, the reasons they have for it. In my mind, it's the design thinking and exploration work that gets to that. And I think there are fewer and fewer excuses for not doing that kind of thing as we become more mature as a field. That's the way I think about it, and the potential benefits.
Yeah, okay, so we are right on time. We only have time for one last question. So in the presentation, you give us 10 not too obvious, but also not overly technical suggestions. So what will happen, say, if behavioral scientists ignore these ideas and they just continue as before?
I think you'll get diminishing returns, if I'm honest with you. I think we may, it's difficult, because on the one hand, I say diminishing returns, but on the other hand, I think there's so much work still to be done in sort of what you might consider to be the more widespread use of behavioral science. Like if you think about administrative burdens, like there's a ton of administrative burden built into the way that public services are designed. It's not particularly complex to remove that. And many of the approaches that have been developed would be very good at removing that. And I think there would be real benefit to society to doing that. So I think we don't want to get too carried away with saying, oh, we should move on from these more established approaches. Because really, if your ultimate goal is to have reduce positive benefits for society, there's a lot more that can be done. I think, though, that it's more like there's also a lot more that can be done by expanding and extending the use of behavioral science in a way that we know that there is the potential to do. So you could continue producing social benefit. The other question is, would people keep asking you to do those things? And that's why I was talking about embedding it into organizations, because there's always a kind of cycle where people get more interested and less interested, and even though you'll continue to be productive. And if you look at the famous hype cycle that Gartner has, you go through a hype cycle and you end in this sort of plateau of productivity. And it may be that you're in that plateau of productivity, but you don't have, and doing great work and improving things, but people aren't so interested in commissioning it. So I think there's also the need to keep showing that more can be done there. And that won't happen if we don't take some of these challenges seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you again, Michael, for this very insightful presentation. And so we would like to thank you for leading our webinar today. A full recording of this webinar will be available at our website by clicking the side tab labeled events and then clicking the sub-tab labeled Bear Webinar Series. Our next webinar will be on February 15th, 2023, and we will hear from New South Wales Behavioral Insights Unit Thank you all for attending. You can exit this webinar by closing your Zoom screen. Thank you again, Michael.
Thank you.